I ended last time by sharing some biographical details about my life. Some people asked me after, are they really true? So yes, they're absolutely true. And I told the incidents from two different perspectives. First as a fault finder, and then as a merit finder. Now the important thing to keep in mind when we think about the merit finder is that it's not that the merit finder doesn't experience pain or disappointment or anger or humility or fear or disappointment. You know, it's very disappointing, to say the least, not to be able to pursue one's goal, if that goal happens to be a professional career in squash. It is very humiliating to be the only person who fails out of a program, and then to have to walk around for a whole year in William James while, you know, feeling like you have a horn coming out of your head. It's not fun. It's painful. However, the difference between a merit finder and a benefit finder and a fault finder is that the benefit finder understands that while things don't necessarily happen for the best, it is possible to make the best of things that happen. Things will be okay. Things will turn out fine. It may take a while until I see the benefit of it. It may take a while until I get over the humiliation or the pain or the disappointment. But that too shall pass. In other words, the benefit finder understands that these feelings are temporary. Gives him or herself the permission to be human, and then understands things will turn out fine at the end. I know that. Been there, done that. Part of life, permission to be human, which includes permission to experience these emotions and also the permission to fail. And we'll talk a lot more about this permission to fail when we talk about perfectionism, because perfectionism is a really intense fear of failure, where we feel that it's all or nothing. Either we have a complete flawless record or it's useless. It's either phenomenal or a catastrophe. All or nothing. The benefit finder understands that human nature dictates that we have painful emotions, and human nature, or being human, dictates that we also fail. And that too shall pass. There are many benefits to being a benefit finder. So the first benefit is we simply feel better. You know, we're happier for it. But there are many, many others. For example, Suzanne Thompson from Pomona University did the following research, where she went to people who had just lost their homes in a fire in California. There were many of them at the time. It was a large wildfire, and many people lost their homes, and she interviewed them after that. And she distinguished between benefit finders and fault finders. The benefit finders didn't say, oh, I'm so glad it happened, but they said, well, there's some positive here. You know, I can start anew. It's a fresh start. I now will appreciate my home more. My family's okay, and I'm relieved, and that's good. So they focused on the positive. When she followed up with these individuals, those who were benefit finders as opposed to fault finders were happier in the long term, were experiencing more positive moods, and less likely to be anxious, and had less physical symptoms, both psychological as well as physical consequences. A lot of research on health benefits. For example, Glenn Affleck did research with individuals who had a heart attack. And there were some individuals who saw it as a catastrophe, the end of the world. There were others who were certainly not happy about it, but said, okay, so this is a wake-up call. There's actually some positive here, because it's telling me I need to take care of myself better, or it helped them revise their personal values. Those individuals who saw the positive, the benefit, who were able to see the wake-up call there, were more likely to survive 8 years later, less likely to have a second heart attack. Now that sounds pretty obvious because, they changed their lifestyle. But it's not just about changing lifestyle. Julian Bauer, we talked about last time, from UCLA, looked at AIDS patients and identified the benefit finders there. Not the people who said, oh, I'm so glad I have AIDS, but rather the people who said, as a result of that, I'm able to appreciate certain things more. As a result of that, I focus more on the things that really matter. As a result of that, I'm getting closer to certain people. The benefit finders, when she followed up 4 to 9 years later, the benefit finders were more likely to survive, were more likely to be alive. Research by Laura King and Miner. What they showed was that it can also be used as an intervention. So it's not just people who were born benefit finders or fault finders, and we know there is a genetic component to it, but there could be an intervention. So they brought in people who had experienced traumas in their lives, and they had them write about these traumas and the, quote, perceived benefit of the trauma. Those who wrote about the perceived benefit of the trauma were physically healthier and psychologically healthier, happier. Another research on cancer patients. The women came in and wrote about their cancer. And they wrote about good things that came out of my experience with cancer. The women who wrote about this visited the doctor's office less often, were more likely to survive their cancer, just by changing their perspective, by changing their focus. Now, these women did not say it happened for the best. Maybe some did, but most did not. They said, I wish I didn't have this cancer. However, it happened. Stuff happens. The question is what we do with it, how we interpret it after. Then they said to themselves, okay, so we got closer to our family. I'm appreciating life so much more now. I can enjoy the breath or a flower, or I couldn't before. My family is so much closer now. I know who my real friends are. And they found benefit in it, not for the best, but they made the best of the things that happened. And that made the difference even to their mortality rates. And there's a lot of research on optimism, benefit finding, and longevity. For example, in a sample of 839 residents in the Mayo Clinic, when they looked at them and they identified the benefit finders and the fault finders, the benefit finders, the optimists, were, after 2 years, were 19% more likely to survive. But by far the most influential and interesting study done in this area of benefit finding and optimism was the Nun study. The Nun study, which showed in many ways that the Bible was correct and that joy does prolong our lives. And the Nun study started in 1932. In 1932, 178 nuns who had just completed their training, they were around the age of 22, just about to embark on their mission, were tested on numerous accounts. And one of the things that they did was write biographical sketches of themselves. And we had this data for decades. And psychologists just very recently opened up the data and wanted to look at it and wanted to understand what predicts longevity. Which of the nuns are still alive today? How long did they live? And this was done in 1932 when they were average age of 22. And they looked for predictors of longevity. So they looked at how complex their essays were. In other words, their intellectual capacities. Zero correlation to longevity. They looked at place of residence. Maybe if they lived in places with less or more pollution, that would impact how long they lived. Zero correlation. California, Boston, no difference. They looked at how devout they were. Their levels of belief at that time, at the age of 22, didn't predict longevity. There was one thing and one thing alone that predicted how long they would live. And that was positive feelings. What they did, the researchers, was look at the biographical sketches. Now, they had no idea who these women here were, so it was completely a blind study, double blind. And they categorized their writings into 4 categories: the most positive, the least positive, and 2 categories in between. And then they compared the most positive quartile to the least positive quartile. And here are the results that they found. Let me give you a sample, though, before, so that you get a sense of what a positive sample is and what a less positive sample is. So here is Celia O'Payne from the positive quartile. God started my life off well by bestowing upon me grace of inestimable value. The past year, which I spent as a candidate studying at Notre Dame, has been a very happy one. Now I look forward with eager joy to receiving the holy habit of Our Lady and to a life of union with love divine. Happy, joy, love. I mean, this is a positive person. Now here is someone from the least positive quartile. As you'll see, this is not someone who is particularly negative, but not a person who focuses on the positive, on joy, on happiness. Marguerite Donnelly. I was born on September 26, 1909. The eldest of 7 children, 5 girls and 2 boys. My candidate year was spent in the mother house teaching chemistry and second-year Latin at Notre Dame Institute. With God's grace, I intend to do my best for our order, for the spread of religion, and for my personal sanctification. Again, very factual, but not as positive, as much of a merit finder, an optimist as Celia O'Payne. Let's look at some of the data now. At the age of 85, and again, this is looking back, 90% of the most cheerful quartile were alive, and just 34% of the least cheerful quartile were alive. And this is a significant difference. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some fault finders who live to 120 and merit finders who die of a heart attack at 30. Of course there are. But on average, the best predictor, what accounts for most of the variance in terms of longevity in this study, was positive feelings, positivity in general. Here is 9 years later, same study. The age of 94, 54% of the most cheerful quartile were still alive, whereas just 11% of the least cheerful quartile were alive. These are remarkable results. Again, you have some sketches, you analyze them today not knowing who lived and who died, and just based on the single factor, positivity, you're able to predict with remarkable, significant levels, you're able to predict longevity, who will be alive and who will not be. Now, when I look at this data, and there's a lot more data on longevity, on health, on well-being, I say to myself, wow, so this is fantastic. Benefit finding really works. Being an optimist is good. And I have 2 questions then. Why isn't everyone optimistic? If we become happier, if we become healthier, why not? Why aren't we all optimistic? That's the first question. The second question is, all right, so I want to be more optimistic. How do I become that? So first of all, why aren't more people more optimistic? And second, how do I become more optimistic? I'm going to answer these 2 questions. Let me begin with the first. One of the main reasons why there aren't more people who are optimistic is that optimists are considered detached. And how do we know that? Well, or what leads to this sense of detachment, to the notion that optimists are detached? It's mostly the media. Because what do we see? We mostly see hatred. We mostly see bloodshed. We mostly see unhappiness. We see terrorism. And then when someone says, well, I'm optimistic, I think the world is a good place, that person, what are you, out of your mind? You're a detached Pollyanna. Just look at all the terrible things in the world. How can you be in such a world? How can you be optimistic? How can you be positive? How can you talk about joy and happiness and positive psychology in a world like this? You must be Pollyannish. In many ways, the message of Thomas Hobbes is correct. Life is short, brutish, nasty, and poor. And that seems much more likely to be true than an optimistic sense of life. Let's look at some of the headlines, and I got this just a couple of weeks ago as I was preparing for this particular lecture. So, Venezuela, a missing jet, flight delays, okay, this is the elections, fresh violence in Kosovo. So a new state was created, and there is violence, this is the focus. Hundreds of homes damaged by quake, and so on and so on. Turkey launches incursion into Iraq, blood duel for Oscar. Okay, that's a good one, I guess. Yeah. Tories spelling dishes. Okay, let's move on. So that was CNN. Here is what was that? I forget which paper I got. I think this is Reuters. Iran nuclear question remains. Again, Turkey. Protest embassies, so on and so on, negativities. This is Fox News. What's the focus? This kid's mom wants out. A mother leaves her child. It's not focusing on the millions and billions of mothers who embrace their children. It's the mother who wants out. And then they tell why. What led the mother to want out of this relationship. And so on and so on. So much negative. How can we be positive in a world like this? It would be really unrealistic of us, wouldn't it? Well, I want to show you an excerpt now by my favorite psychologist, Ellen DeGeneres.
Watching the news the other day, brought to you by Paxil. Well, now I need it. Smart advertising. That's another thing, too. When I was a kid, the news was on once a day. You either caught it or you missed it. Now the news is on 24 hours a day. And that's not enough. They got a guy talking, and then there's a crawl down there. If you got that guy talking, you got the crawl going, you're online, you're putting in your opinion on your poll. No, I say to that, no! There should just be one crawl that goes around over and over again. Things are getting worse. That's all we need. And the local news, man, they want you to watch every broadcast they've got, don't they? It's not good enough you're watching the one you're watching. They do these teases to get you to watch later on. They're so incredibly cruel. It could be the most deadly thing in the world, and you may be having it for dinner. We'll tell you what it is tonight at 11. Is it peas? I feel sorry for the newscasters, We can turn it off, but that's their job, and they have to read these stories, and they're just coming up on the teleprompter. They don't know what's coming up, and they've got to go through this range of emotions that there were no survivors. And next, which candy bar helps you lose weight? Still to come is an asteroid headed towards Earth. But first, where to find the cheesiest pizza in town? Also, a disturbing new study finds that studies are disturbing.
She really is one of the most brilliant psychologists I know, and we'll see a lot of her throughout the semester. Now, so the media does that. The media does focus to a great extent on the negative, and that's not just a bad thing. Because one of the roles of media in a civil society is to highlight wrongs that can be righted, to inspire people to act and to change, to make the world a better place. However, we need to realize that the media doesn't just report reality as it is. It highlights a certain aspect of reality, and there is a media bias involved. The media bias is not left-leaning CNN or Reuters versus right-leaning Fox and Wall Street Journal. That's not the bias I'm talking about. I'm talking about bias toward the negative. The media highlights the negative. It acts as a magnifying glass rather than as a looking glass. And we need to keep that in mind and to correct for that. The media doesn't just reflect reality as it is. Reality is not the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. That's not reality. That's highlighting a specific area of reality and magnifying it. It accentuates the negative, focuses on the negative, the war with Turkey, or the blood spilled in Kosovo, or the mom leaving her child, the hatred. And what it does when it does that is also underrepresent the positive. Now, if you think about it, this is exactly two of the three mental distortions that we talked about. Magnifying the negative, minimizing the positive. In other words, what the media does is distort our perception. It actually makes us into pessimists. Especially because the news is on 24 hours a day, and we're constantly bombarded by negativity after negativity after negativity. And where do we get the positive? 30 seconds at the end of the news. Oh yes, there is also a little bit of good stuff going on. But it's just to make you smile so that you come back tomorrow or the next hour for more bad news. Negativity after negativity after negativity, distorting, creating these cognitive distortions, these psychological traps that we talked about under cognitive therapy. And we become pessimists. Is it any wonder that most people are pessimists when the media has such an impact on us? And again, not to belittle the role of the media, but what I'm doing is highlighting certain aspects that we need to be cognizant of, that we need to counter. And how we counter, we'll talk about in a minute. So what does the media highlight? The frauds, Martha Stewart or Enron or WorldCom, highlighting these frauds, but not reporting on the millions and billions of honest transactions that take place every day, right now as we speak. Highlighting the negative, ignoring the positive. Millions and billions of honest transactions taking place all the time, all around us, constantly. Now, what else is happening? What we're doing, what the media is helping us to do, is extrapolate from a few instances where people want to hurt while ignoring the millions and billions of people who are dedicating their lives to helping spread happiness in the world. Whether it's in soup kitchens to help the world a better place, or whether it's right in our backyard, where over 1,800 Harvard students volunteer as part of Phillips Brooks House. Remember the false stereotypes that I talked about, whether it's here at Harvard or in the United States. So many people dedicate so much time to helping, and yet the focus is on the few that hurt. And that creates a certain schema in our mind where we think the world must be a bad place. The focus is on terrorism primarily. But what about the millions and billions of people who want to live in peace? Again, this doesn't mean we need to ignore the terrorism or the bad or the negative. And this is one of the important roles of the media. At the same time, we shouldn't also ignore the good. The focus in the media is mostly on people hurting other people. For example, through rape, while ignoring the millions and billions of people who are making love every day. And not just in fairy tales. People all over the world, I've no idea who they are. I hope they're not in the classroom. There was Google image. And not just around the world, also right here in Harvard Yard. I don't know if they still have this survey, but the last one I found online was 2004. I don't know what happened since. Now, for those of you who don't believe that there are people also at Harvard right here who make love, here is proof positive. But some do. He's so cute. And the baby is adorable. Okay. Now, what I'm saying here is not that we need to ignore the bad, not that we need to ignore what's not working. We should focus on it, we should look at it, we should improve the world. At the same time, we should also understand that people who say to the optimist, to the benefit finder, get real, are actually missing the point. Because it's not the benefit finder who's detached. It's the fault finder who is. Because there is much more good in the world than bad. Much more. In fact, it's not just about focusing on the full half or the full half. It's focusing on the 90% because there is a lot more good than bad in our world. And it's important not just because it's a nice thing to do, not just because it makes us healthier and happier. It's important because focus creates reality. I mean, we saw it on so many levels. We saw it with the children on the bus that we didn't notice. We saw it when it came to Marva Collins, who said, let's focus on the seed of greatness in these individuals. We saw it with the research on resilience, when the focus was on why are so many failing versus what makes some individuals succeed despite unfavorable circumstances. Focus creates reality. Also, think about it. I mean, when we read about frauds and dishonesty in the newspaper constantly, what we begin to believe, what we naturally would begin to believe is, well, you want to be successful? You want to become the CEO of a Fortune 500 company like Enron? You have to engage in fraud. There is no real other way to succeed. Why? Because the millions of other people who are succeeding honestly are not reported on, or are mostly not reported on. And that's what we focus on. Not to say that it's not important to have whistleblowers and to talk about these things. It's equally important, though, to also focus on those who do it honestly and well, because they are the vast majority, way over 90%. Because if we don't, then a person will think, well, if I want to succeed in business, then I have to, bend the rules. And when an ethical decision comes up, when he or she becomes a manager at the age of 35, they say, well, the only way to succeed is if I bend the rules slightly. And that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or how many people here, seriously, show of hands, once thought of going into politics, becoming, a governor or a president or prime minister? How many people here thought of going in, other than me? Okay, quite a lot. I mean, we know that at Harvard there are quite a few. Now, out of those who put their hands up, how many people were told by others, you shouldn't go into politics, you're too honest? Too honest. We hear it all the time, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because many honest people who could potentially make the world a better place by going into politics don't go in because politicians are crooks. Well, politicians are not crooks. Yes, there are politicians who are crooks, but they're the minority. The majority do honest work, want to make the world a better place, surely make mistakes, they're human after all, but with good intentions, with an ethical code. It's a wonder that there is so much good in our world, while the focus is so much on the bad. It really is a wonder to me. It just shows how powerful human nature and how powerful the good part of our nature is, that we can sustain goodness. Also, how about this? The constant chatter in our mind is, okay, why didn't I do this? Why haven't I done the reading yet? Why haven't I completed my paper? Why did I say that to that person? Why did she say that back to me? Mostly negative chatter. How often do we have the chatter, wow, I had a really lovely conversation today. Or, well, I just finished so much work, I was productive, I did so well. Wow, I just got an A-, and I didn't even work that hard for it. I mean, of course, not here, but I'm saying other places. Why don't we have this kind of chatter in our mind? Again, because our schema focuses on the negative, and we'll talk about change next week, and we'll understand that there are actual neural pathways that have been created by the media, by the focus on what is not working, have been created so that we gravitate toward becoming fault finders. How we change that, we'll talk about that in a minute. It's important to focus on the good. You know what they said about Gandhi? That the most important thing that he did for his country was that he made India proud of itself. He made India proud of itself. That is so important to do. What about America? Are you proud of America? Do we, living here or as Americans, the majority here, do you make America proud of itself? Because, you know, America has faults. It's not a perfect country. It has made mistakes from 1776, and it will continue to make mistakes hopefully for many years to come. But it's still, I would argue, the greatest country in the world. So many people want to come here, want to live here. Why? Because of the freedom, because of the opportunities. Again, not perfect, but a great country. Do we appreciate America? Do we appreciate its greatness? Because if we don't, we can pay a high price. This, you know, it's in vogue now, U.S. bashing. In this country, in this place. And the problem is when we just focus on bashing, when we just focus on the negative, we create a worse reality rather than improving the reality. So yes, we need to be critical, and one of the virtues of this great country is that you can stand out in the street or write an op-ed and criticize the politicians, the system, other people. It's one of the great contributions of this country, free speech. But at the same time, we also have the freedom, and we should exercise the freedom to focus on what is working, on the good. Because appreciating is important. Whether it's a country, whether it's a relationship, whether it's an individual, whether it's students, whether it's teachers, appreciation is important. The meaning of appreciate from the dictionary: valuing, the act of recognizing the best in people or the world around us, affirming past and present strengths and potentials, to perceive those things that give life, health, vitality, excellence to living systems. So, the first meaning of appreciate is to say thank you, and that's a nice thing to do. But it's much more than just a nice thing to do, and we've talked about this before. The second meaning of appreciate is to increase in value. The economy appreciates, money in the bank appreciates, and that's an important meaning, because when we appreciate the good appreciates. When we appreciate the good in our lives, when we appreciate the good in other people, when we appreciate the good in our country, we get more of it. Unfortunately, the opposite is also the case. When we don't appreciate something, whether it's ourselves, whether it's our country, whether it's our relationship, the good depreciates. Remember, I talked about it in the past. Is it any wonder that so many relationships flounder, fail after the honeymoon phase? If the main question becomes, what's wrong, or how can we improve the relationship? And if we just ask this question, our focus becomes on what is not working, on the weaknesses, and we ignore the virtues, the strengths, the things that worked and are working. And when we don't focus on these things, they depreciate. As far as we are concerned, they don't exist, just like the children on the bus did not exist for you as far as you were concerned. What appreciating does is, in essence, create a growth spiral. Let me explain. Let me just give you a random example. Let's say Monday morning or Tuesday morning you're walking toward 1504 and suddenly you see a friend of yours. A friend of yours who you know is genuine, is real, someone you trust. And your friend looks at you and says, "Wow, you look fantastic." Now, how do you feel at that point? You feel fantastic. And you know, you walk a little bit more upright, more proud, and you walk into the classroom just here, and another friend sees you and says, "Whoa, you look fantastic." And how do you feel at this point? Well, fantasticer. And then you come and you sit down here, and another friend whom you haven't seen for a month sees you, "Whoa, you look fantastic." And how do you feel at this point? Fantasticest. And so on and so on and so on. Made your day in an upward spiral. Now think about a slightly different scenario. You walk to 1504 on a Thursday morning, and suddenly a friend of yours whom you trust and value sees you and says, oh my God, what's wrong? Now, there may have been nothing wrong before, there's a lot wrong now. And then you walk in the door and someone else is in, oh my Lord. And how do you feel? Well, you feel even worse. And you sit down and you see someone else who looks at you just completely shocked, and you're feeling worser and worsest, and so on and so on and so on, in a downward spiral. Appreciation creates an upward spiral, and we know it's sometimes one sentence, one word at the beginning of the day, and you have a wonderful day or week. There's research showing how a single sentence very often can impact an entire life. This is work done by Bandura. A single sentence of appreciation can give us strength to go on. Now, the key here is that it has to be genuine appreciation. One of the things we'll talk about when we discuss self-esteem is how destructive and harmful ingenuine appreciation is. And now I'm not talking about, your boyfriend or girlfriend asks you, so how do I look, having just come back from a date and worn something the whole night. You're not going to tell them, well, actually awful. So, okay, we're not talking about these gray areas, but it has to be real. It has to be connected to reality, and we'll talk about that much more when we talk about self-esteem. The key, though, is that we need to understand that there is always something real to appreciate. Think about the studies with the cancer patients or AIDS patients. Even they were able to find something good in a very difficult, tragic situation. And when they appreciate the good, when they find the benefit in that situation, the good appreciates. It grows. Oprah, a real benefit finder. What you focus on expands. And when you focus on the goodness in your life, to create more of it. Opportunities, relationships, even money flowed my way when I learned to be grateful no matter what happened in my life. Because what we focus on appreciates. Again, the metaphor that I've been talking about throughout the course, the seed. What happens to a seed if we don't water it, if we don't shed light on it? What happens to that seed is that it withers and dies, and that unfortunately is the fate of most human potential, most relationship potential, most countries. And if we want it to grow, if we want it to blossom, we have to shed light on it, we have to water it. This is exactly what Marva Collins did with the seed of greatness that existed in every one of her students. This is what the Pygmalion in the classroom experiment showed, was that when teachers were made to focus on the potential in those individuals who were deemed fast spurters, when they were made to focus on it, to shed light on, when light was shed on their potential, that's when the children grew. That's when they fulfilled much more of their potential. So how do we correct the false schema? What do we do about it? Let me share with you some things on the societal level, some things on the individual level. On the societal level, create good news. Not enough of it around. Now people say, well, it's not marketable, it's boring. Well, okay, a lot of it is not marketable. Part of it because it's the norm, it's the usual. But why not report on the great technical advances that are making lives better? Why not report much more on the great medical advances? Why not report much more on peace and well-being? A situation stops being interesting once there is peace. It's interesting when there's war. Well, why not focus more on these areas? Here is a newspaper that was started online, the Good News Network, that I highly recommend you go on to. Just in the last couple of years it was started. Getting people to focus on what is working. About Albert Einstein, about Cambodia gaining independence on that day in 1953. Berlin Wall. Focusing, reminding ourselves of historical good as well as on present good. And they have great news where they talk about. Gimundo, another, I don't even know what that means, but another online newspaper that focuses on things that work. Why not start the day with that as well, in addition to opening the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times? Looking at that as well, just to counter the negative schema. Art, so important in creating a better world, in changing our internal schema. I mean, look at the light in Vermeer's Renaissance artist in his picture. A light during a time where there was not much light. I mean, consider the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. But the artists focused on what is working, on the light, on the human potential, and paved the way to the Renaissance. It all started with art. Or the 17th, 18th, and 19th century Romantics. Beethoven or Victor Hugo. They encountered a harsh reality, but they focused also on the heroic, on the great, on the human potential. Aristotle once said that fiction is more important than history, because history depicts life as it is, whereas fiction depicts life as it can and ought to be. As it can and ought to be. The human potential, and that paved the way to much higher levels of freedom and equality in the world. Or 1930s America, in many ways the heyday of Hollywood, where directors like Cukor, Capra, Sturgis created masterworks during a time when there was a Great Depression, and people used to go to the cinema and watch these films to inspire them and help them get through the difficult time. It was also between the two, the Great War and the Second World War. Difficult time in the world. World recovering and then plunging into another war. And yet the artists continued to inspire. Not ignoring what is not working, not ignoring, but improving. That, by the way, is my favorite movie, Sullivan's Travels. Modern art as well. Wouldn't it be lovely if we go into a gallery and we feel inspired by the art, whether it's by photography, whether it's by sculpting, whether it's by movies or books? There has to be much more of it. And again, one of the roles of the artist is also to highlight what's not working so that it is improved. But if an artist, if an individual is really concerned about improving the good in the world, it is not enough to only focus and highlight what is not working. Because if we don't highlight the good, if we don't appreciate the good as well, the good depreciates. Positive psychology. This is what it is very much about. Remember, there are two things that positive psychologists do when they study. The first thing that they do is focus on what works. The second thing that they do is focusing on the extraordinary, on the tip of the stem. And by doing that, in the words of Miriam, they democratize excellence. Because they're focusing on the good, not ignoring what works in each individual, not ignoring the extraordinary individuals. The Marva Collins of the world, the resilient kids in at-risk population, and so on. Another reason, in addition to the media, why we tend to ignore the good and focus mostly on the bad is that we adapt. We adapt to what is common, and what drives us, what's interesting to us, is the uncommon, the exception, rather than the rule. And because there is so much more good in the world, so much more common, we adapt to it. We stop seeing it after a while. Whereas the bad, the exception, always captures our attention. Why? Because nature created us such that we are change detectors. We're change detectors, and whenever there is a change, our mind immediately goes to that change. Something different that happens. Whether it's something we see or something we hear. For those of you who were asleep. So it's the exception that wakes us up, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that nature was created that way, because it helps us in case of danger. Because it helps us, for example, here when there is a lion coming toward us or trying to creep up toward us. It helps us smell poison, something that is different, that changed. It also helps us hear a sleeping baby. It's incredible how this works. Fast asleep, there can, the house may be falling, you don't get up, but then there is a baby crying and you're up in a second. We're change detectors, and nature has created us such, or God has created us such, so that we can survive better. Now, it's actually a good thing that we adapt on a few levels. First of all, if we didn't adapt, if we were hearing all the noises, we would quite literally go nuts, because there are so many noises right now going on in addition to what you're listening to. People typing, people breathing, once in a while car from the outside, and would go crazy if we were always attuned to everything that was going on. So it's good that we adapt. That's why people can live literally on a highway and still fall asleep at night, because after a month or so they stop hearing the cars there. It's like we have relatives out in Concord who live quite literally on top of the train, and we went to visit them for dinner, and a train passes by, and the house shakes, and it's enormous noise. And at the beginning, Tommy and I looked at each other and and smiled. And then second time the train goes by, and the house shakes, and huge noise. And I couldn't help myself, and I said, "Doesn't that bother you?" And they said, "What?" But you know what I was talking? I said, "The train just passed." And they said, "Oh, we don't notice it anymore." Why? Because it passes every half hour or every 20 minutes. They don't notice it. So it's a good thing that we can adapt. Also in terms of difficulties. Personally, the most difficult experience that I endured was on the 19th of December, 1997. I was living in Singapore at the time. My best friend was coming over from Indonesia to visit me, the person who was most important in the world to me at that time, and her plane crashed. Silk Air Flight MI-185. Some of you may remember this. And my world crumbled. For the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't want to go on anymore. I had no energy. And I called up my family, and then I called up another person who has made a lot of difference in my life, Nathaniel Brandon. For various reasons. First of all, Nathaniel Brandon he's a well-known author and psychologist, had just visited Singapore, had just met Bonnie. And I called him up because he was a psychologist whom I thought could help me, but also because at the age of 45, he lost his wife, who drowned in a pool when she had an epileptic fit, and he found her drowned when he came back home in their pool in their home. So he'd been through that about 25 years earlier. So I wanted to talk to him to get his advice, and I was on the phone and could hardly get my words across. I was crying constantly, and he said to me, "Tal, what I'm going to tell you now is not going to make sense, but it's true. You're going to get over this. I know you are. We get over losses. It's difficult, it's painful. Cry, give the emotions their space, but you're going to get over it. We get over painful emotions. We all do, because if we hadn't, then God help us all. Because if we hadn't, then God help us all." And it took a long time. It was after 3 months that I could start working again. It took a whole year for me to feel some of the bounce, some of the passion for life that I felt before. But now I think about Bonnie and I smile wistfully, sadly, but I can also appreciate the good times that we had together and the privilege that I had of meeting her. We adapt, and that's a good thing. That's an important thing, because God help us all if we hadn't. There is another side, though, to that equation. There is another side. When we adapt, we also take things for granted. And that's not a good thing. Because we take for granted our family that we care about so much. And we take for granted our friends. And we take for granted the food that we're about to have in the dining hall that's served to us. What a luxury. And we take for granted the person who's sitting next to us. And we take for granted the classes that we take here. Because we adapt. And it's a good thing when it comes to the negative. It's not such a good thing when we take life for granted. And the question that we need to ask is it possible to have it all? Is it possible to adapt to the negatives, but at the same time not to adapt as much to the positives? Now, there's a story in the Jewish tradition about a man who was living in one of the shtetls, one of the villages in Eastern Europe, and he really had it bad. I mean, he was living in a tiny home with many kids and with a wife who was constantly nagging him. They were constantly fighting, and they're really terrible. And that man wanted to improve his lot, so he went to the rabbi and recounted to him how terrible his life is. He said, look, we're living in a small home, the kids are all over, no privacy whatsoever, my wife nags constantly, Rabbi, help. So the rabbi said, in your yard, do you have chicken? So he said, yes, we have chicken. For the next week, bring the chicken into your home. But Rabbi, what are you talking about? We have no place. Bring the chicken into your home. The person was a devout man, believed in his rabbi, brought the chicken for the whole week in the home. Feathers, dirt, stinks, you name it. The kids continue to fight even more. The wife nags even more. What are you doing to us here? Our house is small as it is. The rabbi said, and they continue to fight and bicker, and the week finally ends, and he runs to the rabbi and said, Rabbi, help. And the rabbi says, how are things going? He said, well, worse. No place at home. We're fighting. It stinks. It's terrible. My child, do you have a cow in your backyard? Yes, Rabbi. We have a cow. Well, bring her into the house in addition to the chicken for the week. Rabbi, just do it. So he brings in the cow, and again, it's awful, and it stinks to the nth degree, and and they don't even sleep for the whole week, and it's terrible. And by the end of the week, he's looking terrible, disheveled, he stinks. He goes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, help, situation is terrible. Yes, it's so much worse. Do you have a horse in your backyard? Yes, Rabbi, we do. By now understanding the pattern here, take the horse and bring it into your house. So he takes the horse, brings it into the house, and it's awful. The horse is kicking and yelling and jumping and breaks stuff, and there is mess and chaos and bickering and so much worse. And finally the week ends. He runs to the rabbi, and the rabbi says, how are you doing? Rabbi, it's terrible, it's awful. Okay, for the next week, why don't you take out all the animals and come and see me then? And at the end of the week, he comes there and the rabbi says, how are things going? Rabbi, it's wonderful. We have so much place. The smell is so good. We're getting along now like we hadn't ever before. The kids are happy. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Now here is the question. Do things need to get worse before we appreciate what's right in front of us and all around us? When do we begin to appreciate our health? When do we begin to appreciate our health? when something goes wrong with us or with someone else? When do we begin to appreciate life? When ours is in danger or when we lose someone dear to us. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is, must something external, extraordinary, and usually tragic happen for us to appreciate the ordinary? You see, there are treasures of happiness all around us and within us. Right next to us, in the dining hall, sitting next to you here, in your room, at home. There are wonderful things, things worthy of appreciation all around us and within us. But we take them for granted. And do we need to wait? Do we need to wait for that? And the answer is no. No, if we learn gratitude as a way of life. If we cultivate the habit of gratitude. And just as the media has cultivated the fault-finding, we can cultivate benefit-finding. We can cultivate grateful, because when we're grateful for something, we no longer take it for granted. G.K. Chesterton, you say grace before meals. All right, but I say grace before the concert and the opera, and grace before the play and pantomime, and grace before I open a book, and grace before sketching, painting, swimming, fencing, boxing, walking, playing, dancing, and grace before I dip the pen in the ink. Gratitude produce the most purely joyful moments that have been known to man. Think about it. Think about the last time you were grateful to someone and you expressed that gratitude. How did you feel, and how did you make that other person feel? Or when someone was grateful to you, appreciated you, you were walking on air. It created this upward spiral as a result. When it's genuine, when it's real. We don't do enough of it. We don't do enough appreciation. We don't express gratitude enough. Whether it's to the food that we eat, whether it's to writing that we do, whether it's for our friends or family. This is one of the most wonderful books written about the power of gratitude. It's not a research book, but a lot of these ideas, and as I'll talk about in a minute, have been researched. About Gratitude by Brother David Stendal Rast. He also has a great website if you Google his name. How do we cultivate gratitude? His advice is simple and gracious. Why not start by surveying a typical day? What is it you tend to tackle with spontaneous mindfulness, so that without an effort, your whole heart is in it? Maybe it's the first cup of coffee in the morning, the way it warms you and wakes you up, or taking your dog for a walk, or giving a little child a piggyback ride. It is a matter of practice, of doing it over and over again, till it becomes second nature, till it becomes a habit, till we take a state of gratitude and turn it into a gratitude trait. And it is possible to do it. One of the ways to do it is to identify every day just one or two things to do mindfully, to focus on them. Whether it's the first cup of coffee in the dining hall, whether it's the walk to class, whether it's 10 minutes in the afternoon where you just listen to the music in your room by yourself with your eyes closed and focused, appreciating your favorite piece. Taking our time to not just become wine connoisseurs, but also life connoisseurs. This course in many ways is about life appreciation. He continues, gratefulness is the measure of our aliveness. Are we not dead to whatever we take for granted? Surely to be numb is to be dead. Think about this. So Irvin Yalom, Stanford psychiatrist, did a lot of research on terminally ill patients. He went to people who had 3 months, 6 months, up to a year to live, and researched this population. And what he found time and again is that these people, time and again, were saying something to the effect of, for the first time in my life, I feel that I'm alive. For the first time in my life, I feel that I'm alive. Why? Because for the first time, I appreciate breathing. For the first time in many years, I appreciate my husband, my wife, my friend, my children, a flower, the grass, a conversation. For the first time of my life, I appreciate it. Whereas before, the focus was just not there. It was on other things, on the difficulties and the hardships, and mostly on the negative. And remember, as far as you are concerned, the children on the bus did not exist. As far as most people are concerned, the good things in their lives, in their relationships, do not exist. Because when we're not grateful for them, when we take them for granted, as far as we're concerned, they're not there. And then we're numb to these things. We're dead to these things. And it takes a wake-up call, like a terminal disease, to wake us up, to get us to focus on what is right inside us and all around us all the time. Why? Why wait? Why wait? There's a lot of research on the value of gratitude. You read one of, or will be reading one of the articles by Robert Emmons and Michael McCullough from UC Davis. Let me summarize the two studies there into one. So what they did was essentially take random group of people and divide them into 4 groups. First group, every night before going to bed, write at least 5 things for which you're grateful. Big things or little things. Second group, write at least 5 hassles in your life. 5 bad things that happened to you. Third group, write about at least 5 things that you're better than others at, superior to others. And the fourth group, control group, write about anything that happened to you during the day. The outcome measures that they looked at was optimism, happiness, physical health, how often they visited the doctor over the 6 months of the study, one of the studies, how generous and benevolent they were toward other people, and finally, how likely they were to achieve their goals that they set for themselves. In other words, how successful they were. The group that performed the worst was the hassles group. 5 bad things that happened to you. The group that performed at best, that was happiest, most optimistic, most likely to achieve their goals, most generous and benevolent toward other people, and healthiest, was the group that every night before going to bed wrote at least 5 things for which they were grateful, both psychological and health benefits. The study was in many ways the beginning, one of the first studies that they conducted. A book just came out recently called Thanks by Robert Emmons, which is wonderful and traces through a lot more studies and research and exercises that you can do to become more grateful, to have gratitude as a way of life. Physiological benefits such as our heart variability, which is a predictor of longevity, which is a predictor of health, is increased. The parasympathetic system increases when we're grateful, and that induces calm, and that strengthens our immune system. There are also many benefits to trait gratefulness. It's not just a state of being. It's also about a trait. How do we cultivate that? How do we cultivate that? By doing it over and over again. I do this every night. I've been doing it since the 19th of September, 1999. Since the 19th of September 1999, I've been doing it. I've been doing it long before the 2002 study. I started doing it when Oprah told me to do it. Really. And I've been doing it ever since. Let me share with you what I wrote about last night. Was it 26th last night? Yeah. Okay. So, God, family, Tamush, my love, my wife, yoga, I did yoga, David, so wonderful, Shirel, precious, my 2 children, office hours, I had office hours yesterday that I enjoyed a lot. Beep, sorry. Another beep, sorry. Some censorship in this class is important. It took you a while, but okay. Beep. No, just kidding about this one. And Tommy's soup. She made this unbelievable pea soup, which I had yesterday. You know, big things and little things. Big things and little things. And here are other things that I'm grateful for right now. I'm grateful for Sean Acor, the head TF of the class. I'm grateful for his work, for his inspiration. I'm grateful to Deb, the head TF of the other class. I'm grateful to the teaching fellows who are investing so much time in your education, in your happiness, in this course. I'm grateful to Barry, who's there behind the scenes. You don't see him much, but he's responsible for so much of what's happening, for his support, for how humble he is doing all that. And I'm grateful for my students, because there wouldn't be a class. I wouldn't be here today doing what I love to do and what I care about most if you weren't here. So thank you. I'm grateful. Now, the key with this is to do it as a way of, yes, is it cheesy? Absolutely. Does it make a difference? Absolutely. You know, every night I also do it with my kid, with David. And how do I do it? I ask David, he's 3.5 years old, what was fun for you today? And he tells me, and then he asks me, what was fun for you today? I learned about it from a friend of mine, who hand worker, who was here just a couple of classes ago visiting, and I came over for dinner one day, and he heard me speak about this, and he said, I want to show you something. And he has 2 young kids, and they were standing around and talking about the 5 grateful things for which they're grateful. These were young kids, you know, Daniel and Maya, and I looked at it and I started to cry. It was so moving and so touching, and I've been doing it ever since with my kids. My wife and I do it on a regular basis. She puts up with my cheesiness. It helps, it works, because we don't take the good things in our lives for granted. The key when we do this is to maintain freshness. How do we maintain freshness? One of the things that happens with this exercise is that it very often becomes a habit, and we lose it. We lose the freshness of it, we lose the mindfulness of it, and we just take it for granted as an exercise. And the key is, one of the things that Lyubomirsky says is, well, try do it once a week, and for some people once a week is actually better than doing it every day. However, there's also a price. It's much less likely to become a trait if we only do it once a week. So how do we maintain freshness doing it every single day? How do I maintain freshness? Well, fortunately, there's a lot of research on this topic, some of it by Lyubomirsky as well as by others. The first thing is introduce variety. So let's say I write about Shirel, and there are some things that I write about every day. It's Shirel, my daughter, it's David, my son, it's Tommy, my wife, and it's God. I write about these things every single day, and then I write about other things as well. I can write about different aspects of these things. So one day I can write about Shirel's smile, you know, her beautiful 1-year-old toothless smile. And another day I can write about the fact that she's taking her first steps now. So vary. Or one day I can write about one week I can focus about my work, another week can be mostly focused about personal things. And so on. Variety really is the spice of life. Makes a difference here. Second, Ellen Langer talks about mindfulness. She defines mindfulness as creating novel distinctions, which is similar to creating variety. Looking at things that I haven't seen before, that I haven't looked at before. This is also a way to maintain love. You know, people talk about how, well, over time you adapt to your relationships. Well, there's something new to discover about a person every time, whether it's about my parents, whether it's about my lover, whether it's about my friends. Creating novel distinctions, looking at it mindfully, focusing on it, and maintaining freshness through this focus. visualizing it. Stephen Coslin from William James Hall, head of our department, did research showing that kids actually visualize most words. So when let's say they say mother, immediately the picture of mother comes up. Whereas very often for us, when we talk, these words are automatic. We no longer visualize it, which is why it takes kids longer to think, because they're still visualizing the words. It's not automatic anymore, which also explains why kids live like kids, why they're able to appreciate the simplest of things, to be mesmerized and blown away by an airplane up there, or when they talk about what they did at daycare. They live like children. And what we have become over the years, we adapted to it, and we've become numb to a lot of these things. So one of the ways to chip away this numbness, one of the ways to do it is to visualize. And when we visualize, we start to see things once again like kids do. Next time we'll continue with this, but I want to end today by sharing a story with you. A story about the person who, to me, more than anyone else, captures what a benefit finder is. A person who's my role model when it comes to focusing also on the good. My grandmother was born in 1915 in Sighet, Romania. She had a very regular childhood. She was the youngest daughter of 7, one more sister, 5 more brothers. And they were doing well. Many of her brothers became important rabbis, violinists, musicians. And she was a young girl, happy, living the normal life until 1940, which was when Hitler invaded Romania. Hitler invaded Romania and her life changed radically. Her entire family was taken to one concentration camp after the other, ending up in Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, she had over a dozen nieces and nephews were all murdered. Her 5 brothers and parents were murdered in front of her very eyes. At the end of the war, somehow she and her sister survived. The British came to Auschwitz to liberate the prisoners. And when they came in with a doctor, and the doctor would go through the prisoners. Most of them were, of course, dead. Those who were alive, he would say, take that person, leave that person here. Because they had limited resources, limited places. Those prisoners whom they thought would not survive, they left them there. And he comes to my grandmother, who weighed at the time 26 kilos, which is 54 pounds. My grandmother was a large woman, 54 pounds, and said, leave. And then he saw her sister, who was right next to her, who weighed 36 kilos, 79 pounds, and he said, he made this motion to put her on the truck. And of course she was too weak to get up, so the British soldiers picked up my grandmother's sister. His name was Shindy. They picked Shindy up, and Shindy held on to her sister, and she wouldn't let go. And they tried to open her grip, and even though she was weak and sick, they couldn't open her grip. So the doctor said, fine, take them both. So they took them both, and they put them on the truck, and they were, of course, certain that my grandmother would die. A month passed, and she survived, though she didn't put on a single gram. Any day they thought she would die, but she refused to die. After 3 months, she started putting on weight. She survived. 6 months later, she went back to Siget to see what remained from her home. She arrived there, got off the cart with the horse, and a man by the name of Joseph, Yossi, saw her. And he saw a woman who was stooped, who was skinny, who still had no hair, but he recognized those eyes, because those eyes were proud, and those eyes were alive, and he recognized Goldie. And he took her with him, and 2 weeks later they got married. And Goldie got better, and got pregnant, and gave birth to a stillborn. And she got pregnant again, and once again gave birth to a stillborn. They made their way to Tel Aviv from Romania, and they were caught by the British. There was a British mandate at that time. They were caught by the British and sent back to a concentration camp in Cyprus. And there, in the concentration camp, my grandmother in Cyprus had another baby, a baby girl, who survived. And then they had another boy who was stillborn, and my grandmother could have no more children. Her body had just endured too much. My grandmother survived and thrived, as did Shindi. Shindi could have no children, but my mother was her child too, and I was her grandchild as well. And I remember this was in October of 1988. Shindi had passed away a few years earlier, and we went to the cemetery on the day that she passed away to say some prayers over her tombstone. And I went with my grandmother, and we walked there, and my grandmother stood in front of the tombstone, and on the tombstone were engraved not just Shindi's name, but the name of all the brothers and her parents. And she looked at the tombstone and started to talk to Shindi and said to her, "We're so fortunate, aren't we? We're so lucky, aren't we? Look, Talik is here." She called me Talik. And then she told her what I was doing, and she told her what my brother and sister were doing, their grandchildren, and about my mother and father and how wonderful things were. And she was talking about the wonderful things, and she was crying once in a while, missing Shindi. She was so human, just standing there and talking half in Yiddish, half in Hebrew, once in a while talking to me and to her sister who saved her life. And then she said to me, "Let's go." And we walked together, thousands of tombs around us. We walked along the path toward the car. It was a beautiful October day. The sun was out, the wind was blowing. The trees were swaying, and she suddenly stopped. She stopped and looked up, and she stood so proud, so poised, and she held my hand so tight, looking up and then looking at me. She said, "Tal, it's such a beautiful world. Just a pity we have to leave." And she smiled, and we walked. My grandmother saw thousands of corpses. She saw her family murdered in front of her very eyes. She had 3 stillborn children. She did not ignore the terrible things in life. How could she? However, at the same time, she also refused to ignore the good things in life, the wonderful things in life. And she was grateful, and she survived. My grandmother told me that this is a beautiful world. I believe her. Thank you.